before listening to this sermon, if you could read Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 5, there should be a link below this video. And this is just a recording of the sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on the 17th of December. One of the core messages drilled into the new generation is the importance of self-belief. If you believe in yourself, anything is possible, says Miley Cyrus, aka Hannah Montana. If you can dream it, you can do it, said Walt Disney. Anything is possible if you believe in yourself, said Dumbo. As you can see, one of the greatest advocates for self-belief is Disney. But before you listen to the voice of Disney and buy into this believe in yourself philosophy, remember this. The spokespeople for Disney include talking mice, flying elephants, and singing teacups. Facts like this should make us take everything Disney has to say with a pinch of fairy dust. No lab mouse, however much it believes in itself, has worked its way up and become the CEO of an international organisation. No elephant, however much it believes in itself, has ever managed to defy gravity and fly. It's for reasons like these that, before Israel entered the Promised Land, God reminded them of their own smallness. God reminded Israel of their own smallness, and God reminds them to put their faith in someone greater than themselves, i.e., Him. Verse 1. Now when the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. In verse 1, the Israelites' confidence must have been at an all-time high. They'd just seen the Jordan River divide before their eyes, and the hearts of the watching Canaanites were trembling with fear. This was surely the perfect moment to send them in to fight. And yet, God chooses this moment to have Joshua circumcise the entire camp, including the pumped up, ready to fighting men. At that time, verse 2, at that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth. Verse 8, and after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. I highly doubt that Newcastle's manager, Eddie Howe, will be adopting this tactic in the hours before United's next Champions League match. It's hardly the wisest of tactics before entering a battle to have all your fighting men circumcised. And yet God knew the importance of teaching his people something else. Reading from Moses' words in the book of Deuteronomy. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you are more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept his oath he swore to your ancestors. Circumcision reminded this big nation of fighting men of their small origins. Abraham, the father of the nation, was one man when God called him. It was nothing impressive. He came to God empty-handed. It was Abraham's faith in God, faith in somebody greater than himself, that caused Abraham and his family to be so greatly blessed. And though Disney's songs and dances might make the self-belief philosophy look appealing, I'm so grateful to have somebody greater than myself to believe in. To think that I've only got my own efforts to to think that I've got to rely on my own efforts to deal with my guilt. To think that I've got to navigate my way through life using my own wisdom and my own best guesswork. To think that I've only got my own goodness to put me in favour with God. To think I've got to face everything that is ahead of me in my own limited strength. I don't know about you, but thoughts like this terrify me. To think that I've got nobody better to believe in than myself. Thoughts like this terrified the generation of Israelites that left Egypt. The Israelites who left Egypt, the previous generation. These Israelites had seen the Red Sea part and heard the hearts of the surrounding nations were melting in fear of them. But when they stood on the borders of the Promised Land, they saw the big opposition. They looked to themselves and they felt so small. In Deuteronomy we read that the people said, "The people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large, with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there." Self-belief only gets you so far when you face something bigger than you, especially when you leave God out of the equation. Leaving God out of the equation was what caused the previous generation to not inherit the land. That's why God had Joshua circumcise the new generation as they stood in the same place as the previous generation. Would they be like the old generation that focused on their own smallness rather than God's bigness? Or would they be like Abraham, who was aware of his own smallness, but looked to a God who was bigger than himself? So, before you cross the border into tomorrow, ask yourself the following questions. When you face guilt that is bigger than you, where will you look? When in the words of a hymn, when Satan tempts you to despair and tells you of the guilt within, will you look downward to yourself? Or will you look upwards towards the Lord Jesus? Before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea. A great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. When you face life situations that are bigger than you, where will you look? Will you try and navigate through life yourself, even though you currently don't even know what half the buttons on your TV remote do? Or will you look upwards towards God? Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. When you face death, where will you look? The only belief man has found to deal with death so far is a belief system called denial. Thank God that he has given us a better place to look. In the words of another hymn, there in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain. Then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the day he, Jesus, rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. For I am his, and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. Now, before you cross any border, it's essential you understand whose border you're crossing and what laws apply. If you cross the border into Singapore, you must take the chewing gum out of your mouth. Within Singapore's borders, chewing gum is banned. If you cross the border into the Maldives, you must take the pork scratchings out of your bag. Pork products are prohibited in the Maldives. If you cross the border into certain people's houses, you must take off your shoes. You're stepping into their house, crossing into their borders. You must do what they say. Before you cross any border, it's essential you understand whose border you're crossing and what laws apply. Now, God was very clear about who the land Israel was entering belonged to. The first instruction God gave to Joshua was to take off his sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. Holy, meaning set apart as belonging to God. This was God's land, and within its borders people were to obey God's laws. Even if it was just the law of conscience that gives us a sense of what is right and wrong. It's essential we understand this before we reach chapter 6. The Israelites were not kicking these nations out of their land. These nations that inhabited God's land were being driven out because they'd failed to obey God's laws. We read in the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. The land was defiled by these nations, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. After hundreds of years of gross immorality and injustice, those who thought they could live as they pleased would get vomited out. And, as the angelic reminder reminded Joshua in verse 14, this wasn't because God was pro-Israel and anti these other nations. Joshua asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Neither, the commander of the Lord's armies replied. God wasn't pro-Israel and anti these other nations. God would just as willingly vomit ancient Israel out of the land if their behaviour became repulsive as well. God had said, if you defile the land, it will vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Now, just to note, these verses are talking about ancient Israel, not modern day Israel. It's important you understand that because there's a lot of fighting at the moment about the land. It's also important, in the new year, we're going to be looking about the justice of what God did in these chapters of Joshua. We're going to be looking at how they were acts of God's justice further in the new year. But for now, let's look at the practical reasons that God reminded Israel that the land was holy and belonged to him. Well, when Israel entered the land, they faced two dangers. Danger 1, adopting the laws of the other nations that they were driving out. Danger 2, deciding laws based on their own judgment, based on what they saw fit. Firstly, adopting the laws of the nations they were driving out. God had said, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Israel was not to accept or adopt the practices of those around them. In God's holy land, they were to live as God's holy people. They were also not to decide their own laws based on what they saw fit. God had said, you are not to do as we do here today, everyone doing as they see fit. Israel was not to decide their own laws based on what they saw fit. They were to live as God's holy people in God's holy land. Now, we might not cross borders in quite the same way as these Israelites, but we must be equally beware of these two dangers. Firstly, danger 1, adopting the laws of those around us. Adopting the laws of those around us. When you cross the borders into the workplace, there'll be certain behaviours that are deemed acceptable. When you cross the borders into a certain friendship group, there will be certain values that everybody in the group is supposed to share. When you cross the borders into any church, there will be biblical truths that are held onto tightly and others that are held onto very lightly or not at all. The temptation in all these situations is to adopt the laws and behaviours and values of those around you. But wherever we go, we're to remind ourselves that our identity is we belong to the Lord. We are God's people wherever we find ourselves. And God's holy people are to live God-honouring lives wherever their feet land. As Paul says in the book of Romans, do not conform to the pattern of this world. As Peter wrote, but just as he, God, who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. We must beware of adopting the laws of those around us. And we must be beware of deciding our own laws based on what we see fit. There's the temptation to draw our own borders. Within the borders of our own home, we might treat people differently. Nobody's watching, and often we can be a lot more impatient and unkind to those that we're closest to. We might draw borders in our lives. For example, I'll live by this set of standards, this side of this border, at church and in public. But when I'm outside church, when people are out watching, I'll live by a different set of standards. Or we might say, these are the areas of my life that God is free to command my obedience. But these areas are off limits. It's tempting to draw borders in our lives, areas where we'll obey God and areas where we'll not. But because of our identity as God's children, God has ownership of all of us. As Paul wrote in Corinthians, you are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore honour God with your bodies. Now, on first hearing this, it might sound oppressive. Those who usually buy people for a price are not nice people. They're usually involved in human trafficking or slavery. They buy people for as cheap a price as possible, then make a profit whilst the other person's life is destroyed. Having such a person own you is not good news. But in both the Old Testament and in New Testament history, we see God reverse this system. God is a God who frees the slave. And God does this for the profit, not for his own profit, but for the benefit of the other. Verses 9 and 10 in Joshua chapter 5. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal and on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The Passover was a way that they remembered their rescue from Egypt, where they were slaves. For in Egypt, the Israelites' bodies had been subject to harsh slavery. But God had freed them, not for his own benefit or profit, but for the profit of the Israelites. And God knew just how much the Israelites would need reminding of this before they crossed the border and entered the promised land. Just imagine somebody visits a charity shop and pays 50 pence, a whole 50 pence for Mr. Figgis. Mr. Figgis, he should rightly be afraid. Most soft toys bought for 50p from charity shops don't have a promising future to look forward to. They either get tied to the front of a lorry where they spend their lives getting covered in the dirt and grime of a motorway, or they get imprisoned behind the bars of a playpen with a mauling toddler who showers them in saliva. However, if somebody bought Mr. Figgis for a significant price, say 3, 4 or 5 figures, well then Mr. Figgis could be assured that his destiny was a lot different. He would be a valued antique, with a museum staff specifically designated to care for him, Or he might be the treasure of some great family where he'd be the centre of attention. If you have a history of being bought for a significant price, you can be sure that you have a great owner and have a great destiny as well. Israel needed reminding of this. That's why God had them look back at their history via the Passover before they crossed the border. It was to remind them that they served a great master, and though many battles lay ahead, a great destiny lay ahead of them as well. In much the same way, you and I were bought at a price. We serve a great master who is worth our obedience and honour. All that he asks of us is for our ultimate good. Those verses from Corinthians again. You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore honour God with your bodies. Also, the fact that you and I were bought for a price reminds us that we have a great destiny ahead of us. We read in the book of Romans that he, God, did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? As you and I cross the border into next week, whatever battles it might contain, remember, you have a history. God gave his own son to make you and I his own. And if he paid such a price, you and I must have a great destiny to look forward to. And he's surely not going to abandon us on the way.